Hello, and welcome to another episode of Rights for Women. It is, what day is it? It's Tuesday, February 11, as I record this, and we have a great episode for you coming up today with guest host Jo Riccioni, fabulous Jo, who has been on the podcast as an author herself for her two amazing romantasy books, The Branded and The Rising. And she's also been quite a frequent guest host on Rights for Women. So it's fantastic to have Jo back in the guest host spot. Make sure you check out her website, joriccioni.com, and also have a look, if you are a Substack follower, at the posts that Jo did for us towards the end of last year on Substack about her writing process. And that's great reading in there for everybody who is writing. Jo is going to be talking today to Kel Woods, the amazingly talented Kel Woods, whose debut novel After the Forest came out about 14 months ago now, 15 months ago, and her second novel, Upon a Starlet Tide, absolutely beautifully written book, just so many amazing elements, historical fiction, folklore, fantasy, and just woven together with Kell's beautiful lyrical writing style. So always a pleasure to have Kell on the podcast, and this is a really great chat. If you are a paid Substack subscriber, you'll also be treated to an additional 15 minutes of chat between Kell and Jo, where they really zoom in on a couple of issues to do with writing and publishing. And don't forget, you can sign up anytime on Substack to become a paid subscriber and receive all of the bonuses. And also, you can follow along as a free subscriber, and we love that as well. So shout out to everybody who is following along on Substack and supporting the podcasts there. We really appreciate it. Hopefully you caught our first interview for 2025 with Megan Della Camina. It was an amazing interview about the writer's mind. And if you haven't yet had a chance to listen to this, I highly recommend you do. If you haven't listened to that one yet, you might not know that the podcast is now out fortnightly. And we are also then doing things in the off week on Substack. So again, pop on over there and catch us on Substack at Rights for Women. That's it for me. I am working on my novella. My post about that, my recent post on Substack, Diary of a Novella, is there for anybody who has signed up. And I will check in with you about that again at the end of the month when I'm supposed to have finished this draft. We'll see how that goes. No, it has to be done. I've got a deadline, and we all have to meet our deadlines. So that's about it from me. Handing over to Jo Riccioni in the guest host chair this week, and I really hope you enjoy this interview with Kel Woods as much as I did.
Kel Woods, welcome to the Rights for Women podcast. Thank you so much for coming on again. Yeah, it doesn't seem that long since you were on here promoting After the Forest with Pam, having that conversation with Pam. Yeah. And it's not been, how long's it been? Sort of a year and a half?
A year. No, After the Forest came out in October last year. So it would be around a year.
Yeah, it's gone. Yeah, that's so good. I know you were writing the new book already when you were on the Publicity trial, weren't you? Let me just give readers a bit of an introduction to you in case they don't know who you are. Your first book, a novel, After the Forest, was published internationally in 2023 to quite a lot of critical acclaim and became a Sunday Times bestseller. And then Upon a Starlet Tide is going to be published in February 2025. We're doing this interview a little bit early, prior publication, because things get a bit crazy with Publicity. The book comes out. So I got in early with this interview. And your background is basically, you've studied librarianship, you've studied English literature and creative writing. And just to give readers a little bit of an insight into the type of books you write, they're the most amazing blend of fairy tale, history, folklore, and fantasy. So yeah, it's great to have you back on the podcast. Jill, before we kick off talking about the new book, can you tell us a little bit about your pathway to publication? Because I always love this question, because I think a lot of emerging writers are really interested in how people get their breaks.
Yeah, it's a good question. And I remember when I was dreaming of being a published author, I could not get enough stories about how people were breaking into their publishing world. So yeah, in a nutshell, I did a lot of courses and classes and workshops and worked really hard on my craft and my technique. I always had a degree in creative writing, but I hadn't done anything with it for about 10 years or whatever. That was sitting in the background. So when I decided, no, you know what, I'm going to give this a good hard nudge, And I looked at learning from people who were writing the way that I wanted to write. So I targeted Kate Forsyth and went to a few of her classes because I'd read Bitter Greens and I wanted to write a book that blended history and fantasy and fairy tale the way that Kate had. So I ended up going to classes with Kate, which then led to doing a mentorship with Kate, which I did through the Australian Society of Authors. And then that led to pitching to agents overseas and getting an agent. So I got an agent first in the UK. And then my agent led to getting the 2-book deal with Tor in the US. How it started. Yeah.
No, was that mentorship with Kate, was that a something you won, or did you pay for it?
I won it. So she does, I think I asked her the other day about this because I saw her at a festival and I got asked this question at a festival and she was in the audience. And yeah, she's still just doing one a year. It's pretty competitive. I think there were, out of the 12 of us who won mentorships through the ASA that year, I think maybe 6 or 7 of us wanted to work with Kate.
Wow.
If you get to say which, there's a whole range of different authors who are doing the mentorships and you can pick which one you want to work with. So I was so lucky that she chose me. She was like, yeah, I'll work with Kelly, and did that with her. And she was also very generous with her time. So she was only supposed to give me 25 hours of her time, but she gave me a lot more than that. We did probably 3 quite heavy structural edits together. I learned so much from her. And also I had access to her thoughts on whether or not to go for an agent. She thought I should because I was writing a fantasy book set in early modern Germany. And we just knew it wasn't going to be the kind of book that would be really looked at in Australia. It was really going to do better in the US and the UK. And so, yeah, I got that advice and that support. So the path of going through classes and mentorships is a good one because you're going to learn a whole lot at the same time. So that's how I did it.
I think it's something that emerging writers often forget, actually, is thinking about going for mentorships. The tendency to go to for competitions and emerging manuscript prizes and things like that. But mentorships can actually be so much more valuable because you get that improvement from it. You get that, and especially if you have a good one. Kate is known for being a really generous and really organized teacher as well. I can imagine that you learn so much from it.
I wouldn't discount the competitions. My focus was on getting better. I always thought to myself, if I'm going to get published, I need to be writing well. I need to be able to write well. And so that was focus. But yeah, I don't know. There's all these different pathways, right?
Yeah, and that's why it's such an interesting question, right? Because there are so many different ways that people have approached. And I've spoken to lots of writers recently who were on the cusp of self-publishing and then got picked up by traditional publishing. So there's so many different routes into the industry. All right, so tell us a little bit about the new book, because let's put it in the context of After the Forest, because After the Forest, you chose to write about Hansel and Gretel, but after, a long time after the events of The Witch in the Wood and Our Gingerbread House. And it was kind of grown-up lives that you chose to deal with in a very historical way. And then the elements of fantasy arrive later on. But tell us what you've chosen to do with On a Starlet Tide.
Yeah, Upon a Starlet Tide, I've got the one.
It's such a beautiful cover. I cover, hold it up again.
Yeah.
It's divine cover.
Yeah, it's so beautiful.
So how much say in that, Kell, before? Do you have much?
Yeah, I did actually. We talked about the cover. I think I didn't really have a say until we got back the initial roughs and we had a look at her. And I remember I asked if she could be a bit softer in her face. And I asked if she could have, if she could be wearing a corset. And so the artist went back and refined that. So I asked for little changes, but generally the whole thing, they just nailed it. So the first time. So I didn't really have to do much. I just love her. And I'll show you too, because we're showing things. I was going through my box of all of my research stuff. And this is one of my reference images that I used.
Oh, it's beautiful.
Yeah, it's like a vintage poster. I think it's a fashion poster, but I just loved her hair and her tail and her holding that slipper. And I sent that to them. Like I sent them some of my images from my mood board, like my reference things that I'd used. And yeah, I love the cover. I'm so pleased with it. Sorry, what was the question again?
Tell us about it, because nobody knows what it's about yet.
It's a mashup of The Little Mermaid and Cinderella. So I pulled those two fairy tales together and pulled elements and symbols and motifs and built a new story out of it. So it's a rough retelling of The Little Mermaid and Cinderella, but it's like a new historical fiction with fantasy. So it's like it's less a retelling and more of a new story based fun. There's still plenty of those little echoes for the fairy tale.
I like that of pulling motifs rather than reworking a story, because that's not what you're doing. You didn't do that in Arms of the Forest either. It's almost like you've just picked out your favorite motifs of those fairy tales and played it until they become your own, really.
Yeah, and seeing how they play off each other as well. I was really interested in how those two fairy tales, like the similarities and in the shape of them and the characters. They both have a fairy godmother and the sea witch. They both have a prince. They're both quite romantic. Musical. One ends really happily and one ends really badly. So there's that element of tragedy and darkness and strangeness with The Little Mermaid that probably called to me more. And I think that's more primary. So much fun to go through and see how I could pull them together. I just loved it.
Yeah. There must have been so much research that you did on sea mythology, like Selkies and sea witches. Tell us a little bit about that, going into that.
Well, that part of it had to wait until I'd found the setting, because to me, I only, like with Out to the Forest as well, I really chose mythology and folklore that belongs to that part of the world. So with this book, it was hard because you had The Little Mermaid is Danish, it's Denmark. Copenhagen was where she is, where the statue is. And I think everybody thinks of that place when they think of The Little Mermaid, but I didn't want it to be too dark and cold. I didn't want to set it in Denmark. When I was looking for a location, and then I had Cinderella, I thought, somewhere in France would be beautiful. I could make it a little bit warmer, a little bit brighter and more colourful. And particularly with the sort of Rococo, the Baroque setting as well. So once that had all fallen into place, I got to have a look at the folklore and the mythology in Brittany. And there's so much of it. Like, they have the most amazing magical creatures and folklore and stories. And so, there was a wealth of stuff for me to pick.
Because you have stuff I've never heard of in there. I can't even pronounce the name of what you got. Well, how do you pronounce that word?
Oh, it's something like gross or something like that. I can't even say it either. Like a sea hag, sea witch character. But it was just perfect because I needed one, and there they were. There were all these, cool women and tide women and all of these magical folk that live on the shore. Oh, it was just like a smorgasbord, Jo.
That was fun. Oh, fantastic. And do you want to give us a little reading? Have you got a little bit of section that you can read for us to give us a bit of the voice?
Yes, I think that.
The thing that I want to convey to listeners about your writing is that you are really in this kind of very lyrical tree world of fantasy, fairy tale folklore. And I just love the cadence of your writing. It's so beautiful. So let's have a little listen.
Okay, I'll just do a little bit of the first page. So this is chapter 8. It's called Wrecked, and it's in Closplay in Bretagne, in Britain, in May 1758. She thought him dead at first. A man draped lifeless upon a wedge of broken hull, cheek pressed against the timber as tenderly as a lover's, as he rose gently up, gently down with the exhausted breath of the sea. The storm had raged all night, howling and hurling itself against the shore, rattling the window so hard that it had taken all of Lucy's will not to fling them open and feel its cold breath on her face. Only the ship's drapes, her mother's great pride, had stopped her. Papa had brought the fabric all the way from India, and there was no telling how Gracia would have reacted had Luce allowed the weather to spoil them. And so she had kept the window closed, watching the storm as it battered the gardens and orchard and pried at the roof of the dovecote as though it would rip it free and toss it, rolling and bouncing, down the sweep of rain-soaked fields and into the furious waves. It was the kind of weather that stilled the world and sent folk hurrying indoors. The closed shutters and covered mirrors for fear of lightning strikes. The caused ships to fly before it into the harbour at St. Malo. One ship, at least, had not been fast enough.
Yes, it's amazing. Did you go there for your research? Did you get to go?
Sure did. Yeah, I did. It was
It's a
amazing.
special place, isn't it? Because it's stunning. Yeah. the way the water comes in so fast that way. And
Yeah, the big tide, like I think they're the biggest tides in Europe, and crazy tides, and so that seemed to be a really great way to bring in tide magic. And there was just so much in that culture, in that landscape to draw upon. It was really fun. I went with my husband, so we went on a research trip. We started in Paris and went to the Louvre and the Museum of Decorative Arts to have a look at all of the clothes and the furniture and all of
he
them.
was thrilled with that.
No, he was okay. He was okay until there was this extra exhibition at the Louvre, and it was all about hair.
Oh, I remember seeing your Instagram post about it, about the week.
Yeah. And he was just like, "Oh my God, just get me out of here now." He was done. But we also did a lot of hiking because you've read my books. I love nature and wild places. And so when we go, I tend to try and get away from towns, away from people, and out into the landscape to try and find where it would have been at its most raw, how it might have been in 1758, to those untouched places, old farmhouses, of the old manors where a lot of the story takes place. So we did a lot of hiking, a lot of eating pastries, and he liked all that. He loves all that. He loves hiking and photography. So we had a lovely time. But he was, he was very patient with the museums.
You were working. You did say you were working, didn't you?
Yeah, I said that. I said that this is work. You have to just carry my bags, drive the car, do the logistical things, and then at the end of the day, we get to go and have a gin and eat a nice meal. And so he was okay with that. He made it. But the hair was too much. The hair was too Joe.
The house where you set the story is not the country girls.
Yeah,
it felt like a real place because you've got this walled chapel, and when Liz is able to escape the house through the chapel, felt so real to me. Was it a real place, or did you make it up?
No, it's real. Yeah.
No.
And that's the beauty. I saw a couple of chapels like that in the Malunias. What they are, what the houses are, they're called Malunia, and I might be saying that wrong, which means of St. Malo, like Maluan. And what they are is the ship owners and the corsairs were so wealthy at the end of the sort of 1700s going into the early 1800s. It was the golden age of corsairs, and they were making so much money raiding other ships and trading. They were incredibly powerful and wealthy. And so Malo was tiny. It's like a little tiny, you've been there, right? It's tiny little walls. And it was very crowded and overpopulated, really stinky, especially in summer. And so these wealthy bougie merchants who became really wealthy went and built themselves these glorious sort of pleasure houses, almost like follies, really. They were just summer houses. They would go and they had big gardens where they could grow their own produce and vegetables and bring it up to the city because there's no gardens or earth in St. Malo. It's just stone. It's just like this walled city on the sea. But there's all these beautiful, there's 112 of them left, I think, in the sort of vicinity of St. Malo. And we went to some of them. Like one day we just had the hire car and we just drove around to find as many as possible. And I'd marked them on a map and I knew exactly where they were. And so my husband was very good because he drove on the wrong side of the road and got me around all these weird little streets. Yeah. It was wonderful. Yeah. So most of them are privately owned, so you can't go in. A couple of them are hotels and they have weddings and things there. But there are a couple that are open to the public. And so I got into one and we were inside it and it had a chapel. And so I hadn't had that planned. I hadn't written that way to escape the house until I'd gone over and saw the chapel. And I was like, oh my God, this is perfect. So that's where the research trips are absolutely worth it for me because post book, I've found new things that have gone into the story and been parts, like really good parts of the story that I wouldn't have got if I hadn't gone.
Yeah. So had you already started writing at this point when you were on the research trip?
Yeah, I had a draft done. Yeah.
Already done the draft.
Yeah. And that's how I'd always want to do it. Like I'd want to go with the story in my mind. And then if you see something cool or see what I might have written in a particular location and been completely wrong. So it's good to have it written, I think, and then go when you've still got time to do another draft on it to really polish it up. That's how I would do it.
The next question I was going to ask you was, how do you stop? Because you're all very good at not making it a heavy it doesn't come across as a heavily researched historical novel. It comes across as well researched, like with loads of really interesting, cool details, but it doesn't overtake the story. Your story is still propelling all the way through the narrative. It's going off on a tangent into historical detail. So that makes sense that you're already written the story almost before you start to go and do the research. But how do you handle your reading and your historical reading around the topic? Do you still carry on? Do you put things in and then take stuff out when you realize it's getting in the way?
Yeah. So my first drafts are always big. I cut and cut and cut. Like first draft, put it in, and then the second and third and fourth and fifth for this one. Like this book, I worked really hard on, lots of edit, lots of polishing. I do research really heavily, and I probably cut out so much stuff that just wasn't necessary. But this is testament to Kate Forsyth's mentorship, because she taught me probably everything I know about this, and the story has to come first. And I remember her saying when we were working on After the Forest, every sentence has to pull its weight, every paragraph has to pull its weight, and every chapter has to pull its weight, and every scene has to pull its weight. So if I've got a massive paragraph of historical fluff, that's not pulling its weight. It's weighing down the story. And you always want that story to be climbing and climbing and getting more intense and more, pulling the reader towards that climax. So I keep that in my head all the time as well. But in the first draft, no, it's full of crap, Jo.
Everything goes so much better. It's like taking a batch draft at the moment.
Yeah, but you put all that stuff in. I think you have to overload it with all of your research, because then it's there, where it fits, and then you might have a paragraph, but then by the time you're going down to the end of the book, you might have nailed that down to just one very small line, or one tiny detail about the harpsichord, or one tiny detail about the kitchen. So you got to find that telling detail, that really interesting, and hopefully as well, if you can work it into dialogue or part of the narrative or part of the conflict happening in a scene, even better. So that's how I think that's how I do it. I don't really think about it, but I think that's probably how I do it. It's definitely part of the editing process.
Yeah, for sure. Now, there's one thing that comes up and that relates to Summer Low, and that is you saying the town of Summer Low is all based around stone.
Yeah.
One of the really cool things that I really like, which you probably think is quite unusual and weird of me to pick out of all this detail of this book, is the fact that the stone becomes a really important plot point in the book. And I'm not going to say what it is, but that is the fantasy element, a stone on which Summer Low is built. So did you get that idea before or after you'd visited Summer Low? Can you remember?
Yeah, I can remember, because I got it after. And to be honest, that was the last idea that came out in the editing process. And it had such trouble. It was a really hard book to write. And I think it was because that element, that idea of the stone, didn't come to me until I was home. I'd done the trip, I'd done a couple of drafts, and we were in edit. So it pulled the whole book together.
It did. It did. Yeah. Weirdly, it wouldn't be something you'd first think of when you think about this type of fairy tale, this type of story, and this fantasy. When you think about archetypal images, you think about the sea. You don't think about stone. And it is like, it makes sense because it's the opposite of what the rest of the book is about, water and about finding things washed ashore. So, yeah, I just really thought that was a really clever plotting device.
Right. Yeah, thank you.
It speaks to the organic nature of writing in a way as well, but it isn't always there from the beginning.
No, and it was hard to write. It was a really hard book. I was on the wrong track right up until the end. It started. It was tough. And it was funny, that stone, because it was so obvious. Looking back, it seemed so obvious that you would do it that way, but it wasn't. Once again, it was research. Looking at that granite, that most of the city of St. Malo and all the houses and Moliniers are all made of granite. And most of that granite was quarried on the coast of Brittany or over on the Chaucer Island. And then looking at shipping and how they carried ballast stones to keep them steady in the water. Yeah, and then pulling together the granite, the stone walls, the ballast, and also all that folklore in Brittany. And they have dolmen and like the standing stones, which are really Celtic. So there's all these incredible standing stones that are really magical and powerful and ancient in Brittany. And so when you start looking at the folklore around the stones, the granite, the magical creatures inhabiting the shore, which is made of granite and was mined to build the town. And that's where it came from. But it took time for all of those elements to find each other in my subconscious. Yeah. But I'm so glad you noticed that. Thank you.
It's not the obvious thing. The obvious thing with your writing and the stories you choose is food and clothes. Yeah, and clothes. You love food and clothes. I love food and clothes as well. And anybody who loves food and clothes is going to love your books because the clothing description and there's so much beautiful research done around that. And obviously, testament to you visiting museums and reading around that topic. But yeah, the stone, I just thought, for me, when I think about plotting, and I'm not a great plotter, as you know, we've had this conversation before, it does reassure me that if you are there ready and waiting, the plot will deliver itself at some point. When you're working hard enough on a manuscript and you're stuck, if you just keep turning up and keep working it, something is going to happen. The magic's going to happen. And I think that for me, I could almost single that out as that being the point in the book where it all came together.
Yeah, it did. It affected everything. Yeah. Anyway, it's just so funny that it came late. I was like, oh my God, why couldn't I have told us this a year ago? Oh my God.
Yeah, but the things that are the obvious things, though, aren't they? Often.
Yeah.
It's like whenever I teach plotting and I'm talking about how to raise tension, I always use Jaws as an example, talking about the sea theme. Because Sheriff Brody, how do you make it more interesting? How do you make the plot line more interesting? Well, have him scared of the water, have him scared and unable to swim. Yeah, yes, it makes sense. All right, well, so just on the topic, before we move away from the topic of research, I always ask this to historical novelists, because I think this is one of the most fascinating parts of writing historical fiction, is that you turf up these absolute gems that sometimes make it into the book, but sometimes don't. Did you find any of that sort of? I know that one of the things that I really loved, and it may just be an image that you played around with because of mermaids, that is this thing with her father telling Louise not to brush her hair.
Yeah.
On store at night because it can bring about storms. Was that something you turfed up historically or amongst myth or?
Yep, that's folklore. That's a real thing. It was bad luck for women, particularly, to dress their hair or brush their hair after nightfall. Because if you had a husband or a brother or a son out at sea, you were endangering their lives because you could bring up a storm. You could affect the weather with your hair, which ties into all of that sailor superstition that there's so many female figureheads on ships. Yeah. It's so interesting, and it mirrors the way that women, like misogyny and the way women are viewed. And on one point, women are the worst of luck, and you never want one on a ship because they're just the most terrible luck, and you do not want them anywhere near your ship. But on another side, the sight of bare skin and naked breasts of a woman will calm the sea. So you'll see these figureheads with these, bare-breasted or women with some kind of fabric over them because they were meant to calm the sea. So there's all these weird alternating pieces of folklore, but the hair is a real thing. Sticking the knife in a mast, I mentioned in the book, that's a real thing. Upside down shoes, even to the point of where if a man is walking to his vessel to sail out, if you approached him and intercepted him when he was walking to his ship and talked to him, you're basically cursing him. Fascinating stuff. I don't think I used that, but there was so much of it. Like there was so much of the sea lore and the folklore. It was just fascinating. The chapel was one of my best finds for sure. That was like, oh my God, this is brilliant. Of course, this is the way that she could get out. And we saw a couple of those. A couple of the Millennials had them because back in the day, the folk who farmed and looked after the peasants would have gone up to the millennium and gone to the services because they were very Catholic, would have got their services with the family. So they had their own entrances so they could get in that public door. And then there was a private door opening into the beautiful gardens in the manor or the mansion or whatever you want to call it. Another one I found was, and this was a tough one. I originally, in my earlier drafts, there's a lot of folklore around drowned cities. And I do touch on it briefly in the book. The city of, I think I call it Keris, the lost city of Keril. And Radlin and his daughter, who he threw into the waves to save himself. So apparently off the coast of San Malo, there's a drowned city that, it was walled and reclaimed from the sea. And their daughter, depending on different tellings, as always, sometimes she's a harlot, and she and her lover opened the lock and the sea rushed in and flooded the city, and the whole place ended up under that whole drowned city thing I love. And there's that really eerie things, like you can hear the bells in the cathedral ringing under the waves on a still day. All this kind of cool stuff. And apparently there's one off the coast, I think in Scilly in England. Apparently there's a drowned city. It's a whole thing. And I originally had more of that in the book and then pulled back on it because it wasn't really relevant to the story.
Yeah.
I did end up using it much more than it is in there in references and things in the book, but it's not as important as it was in earlier drafts. It's so hard to pick and choose what.
Yeah, but I think you do know after a while when you spend time with the book, you do know instinctively what is really whose story it is and what it's supposed to be.
Yeah, fun to find that.
Yeah, one of the things I'm always curious about with your work, Kel, is why the fantasy element? Because there are so many people who would have just written your books but not put any fantasy in. They would have just taken it as a kind of historical tale.
Yeah.
Well, where does that love come from?
I think I'm just an idiot. Like I've discussed this with Alison Tate because she's asked me that question. She's like, why do you do this to yourself? Because it's the two hardest thing, like all the work that you would do for historical fiction and then having to do all of the creating the magic system and all of the fantasy stuff as well. So if I was an intelligent person, I'd probably just choose one. But for some reason, I'm a sucker for punishment and I like both. I like that's the kind of book I like to read. I love that where it's grounded.
Why leave it out when you can have it all?
Yeah, why do you have to choose, Jo? No, I think when I did start out with this book, it wasn't magical enough because I hadn't yet found the granite, the stormstone. So the magic came after the history. So I started with the history. And I probably did that a little bit with After the Forest as well. It's a starting point, and then from there you can add in your fantasy elements. But then you never know. In another book, like I'm working on something now and I'm much more aware of the mythology and the magic. So I think it just depends on the story and how you approach it and what it needs and how much. I found the research for Upon a Starlet Tide was hard because St. Malo and its history is niche. A lot of people don't even know. They've never heard of it. And I found the French seem to be more protective of their history than, say, the Germans. I found so much information in English about Germany, about German history in the Black Forest. I found nothing in English. All the research I did for this book was in French. I was on Google Translate like constantly. Getting to certain scenes at the end, there was a historical event and I had so much trouble. There was only a couple like primary sources from that time. And I ended up having to get a friend of mine who's I used to work with her at the library. She speaks French. And I ended up saying to her, for God's sake, can you help me find this diary of this dude who was there on the night that I happened? Really obscure, all in French. And she found it for me. And then I had to hold my phone over it and translate it. Like it was so hard.
Translate so liberating though now. Imagine, not many years ago, we would have had to send that to a very expensive translator to get it translated.
Yeah. Yeah. I wouldn't be able to write these books. No way.
No way. You'll have a go, Kel, but they might just be slightly different with different little details. So I love the fact that you have inclusivity, and it did get a very strong Pirates of the Caribbean vibe at one point, which I loved because it was like a little Easter egg that I wasn't expecting. The moment in the forest, I'm not going to say too much about it because it's a bit of a plot spoiler, but I did love, and I was like, she definitely thinking Pirates of the Caribbean. Oh, they're wrong. Correct me if I'm wrong. Yeah, it's only a very sort of little fleeting moment. Yeah.
I don't even know what that is. We need to talk about this after. But I love Pirates of the Caribbean, so it was subconscious. And I was looking at Keira Knightley's outfits and her pirate outfit, like when she wears in the middle, when she between the damsel and then she ends up the captain. But that outfit where she wears the tricorn and the breeches and the coat, I was very closely looking at what she was wearing for what Luce gets around in. So there's, definitely pirates.
Oh, yeah, and we'll talk about it. I can't talk about it now because it's too much of a plot spoiler. That's loud. Pirate, female pirate. Come on. It's just, I love it. I love female pirates. So, yeah, I was just totally on board with that. Same. Okay, so what I want to ask you about is heroes and heroines. I love the fact that Luce is so lovable, but she has these kind of like elements of, she has whole parts of her personality and character and that she doesn't understand. She doesn't understand her magic. She doesn't understand who she is, which I love. And that's just a fairy tale. That there's a dark element. She's got darkness in her that could go dark. But I just love the way she's still very likable. But the person I really want to talk about is Samuel, because Samuel, my new book boyfriend, is so perfect. He is such a perfect hero. And I just want to unpick him and find out how you did it, because it is quite an art to creating a male character who is hot but not corny, because that is hard to do. You know, masculine and not overbearing, and gives her totally her space and allows her to make her own decisions. And it's flawed but still lovable. It's very difficult to do, and I think you've done it impeccably with Samuel, because I can really just feel as though I know him very well, and he's very sexy. So
Yeah.
you have someone like an actor or
Yeah, I had a mood board for all of the characters. Like that was one of my first things I did was just make in Canva. I just made a little like all different images and a whole mood thing. And Samuel was a mix of what's his name, Chris Hemsworth in The Heart of the Sea. You know how cute he is in that movie with his before he gets all starved and. See, Samuel wouldn't be as buff as that. Chris Hemsworth is unrealistically large and buff. I don't think anyone in the 18th century would have acquired that size, except in maybe fantasy books.
Yeah.
Do. And he was also a bit of a mix of Sam Claflin, pirates, because there was that vulnerability to that character. Also the color of his hair and his coloring. And I have a bit of a thing for Sam Claflin. Really a mix of those two was my visual. I was very keen on him having the ends of his hair being really sun-browned because he's out in the water all the time, like a surfer almost, like that, how their hair kind of crisped by the sun. But I don't know. He was one of the easiest characters to write. He just seemed fully formed. He was easy. And I don't know if that's because he swears so much and I love swearing. So I don't know if that's with me.
Yeah. We've had this conversation before, and I love swearing as well. I love it. Yeah, it was the swearing that I remembered most about him. I think I remember most about him being realistic in that he's had a past before he meets Luce. So that's not, and it doesn't put me off. That's quite attractive to me. And I think it makes him attractive to her as well, that he's been around the block a bit.
Yeah.
Yeah. And he's the sea dog in a way. He knows the sea, doesn't he? He's very, very good at what he does.
Yeah, there's a sea dog and there's a calmness, I think, which he's very calm and capable, which I think is something that women seem to appreciate, or I do, especially when men like that are quite contained.
Yeah.
Full and capable, but also very calm and almost gentle. There's something really appealing about men like that. I can't tell you exactly what I did with him. He just seemed to be, he was one of the easiest characters to write. And I really loved writing scenes with him because he focused more on, I think I read something somewhere about how sometimes female authors don't like writing in the point of view of men, and men won't write in the female point of view. And then I think it might have been Joe Abercrombie who said, they're just people. It doesn't matter what gender you are or whatever, whoever you are, what you identify as, you're still a person in there. And so kind of how I approached that, I was like, he's a person with feelings. So let's just focus on his feeling, like on him as a
Yeah.
person. And then obviously, sorry, say that again. Adding in the hotness as well.
That's just you fantasizing on the page.
Yeah, I really wanted him to be that kind of rugged sort of sea dog. Yeah, definitely. It was fun. I'm glad you liked him. I love him too.
Really, really, really good character.
Yeah.
I've made some of my favorite tropes in this book, which is love triangles. I love a love triangle. I know there's readers out there that don't like a love triangle. And I'm like, no, give me a love triangle every time because it's just like inbuilt tension. So in love triangles are really nightmare. I one of my favorites, lovers across glass divides. Yeah. I love that one. And you do it so well. Yeah, no, because they can't really be together. And you do it twice, actually, don't you? You do it with Lucy's sister as well.
Yeah.
When you're playing around with these parts of the plot, is it because they're your favorite tropes, or is it just what the plot needs, time?
I think that comes from 18th century France as well. There was so much in my research. We're in the years before the French Revolution. So this is the time when the aristocracy and the nobility were so ridiculously wealthy. And the rest of France were starving and working so hard and just living so badly, which eventually, obviously I'm simplifying it, but led to the French Revolution. By the end of the century, life was completely different. So I was very aware that class would have been a very important element. I did find when I was researching the lives that the daughters would have had and like education and tutoring and tutors and how that worked. Because the girls have a good education and they have tutors coming to the house and they're unusual for women. Usually women wouldn't have that level. Often it was just the male, like the sons who would have had access to all of the natural sciences and mathematics and science was booming. So the whole idea,
But a flex, wasn't it, for the father, really? That's was in that way, was just a total status symbol flex, really.
yeah, and could afford it. And yeah, absolutely. And when I was reading about tutors and the history of tutoring, there were stories about the girls running off with their tutors. And that was just devastation for the family because it was such a class divide and it was so shameful. And yeah, that once again came out through the research. So much comes out through the research.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it was good to have a couple that work together, those two storylines. Yeah, I'm glad it worked.
Good. Yeah, I know it did work. I really liked it a lot. So I'm just going to ask you about what you're working on now. I know you can't talk about it too much, but you are working on a new book. Is it still going to be a similar sort of formula in that you will look at fairy tales, or are you going something completely different?
No, it's going to be similar. It'll be a fairy tale retelling / historical / fantasy, and I'm already working on it. I'm in the very early days, so I can't really say too much. But it's such a weird thing to go from doing the proofs and having this really polished, finished book to going, oh my God, I've got nothing, and how am I going to do this? But the pressure, I felt really scared about that after the forest. The second book syndrome got me good.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about second book syndrome. Did you feel pressure?
Yeah.
Especially when your book does quite well.
Yeah.
After the forest did it, the publishers and agents don't really help because they start to add the pressure because they're asking you constantly what's the next say.
Yeah, and hoping and saying, oh, it needs to be better than the first book. Helpfully saying it needs to be better and then just like striking the fear of God into my soul. Yes. Yeah. So I definitely had second book syndrome, and that probably, looking back, blocked me from having that freedom to play around with ideas. That's probably why I came to the idea of the stone and the granite so late. That's why it came. Maybe I was blocking myself with terror. So this time I'm way more relaxed and confident, I guess, because I've done it twice and that's not a fluke. Once might be a fluke, but twice is good.
Yeah, definitely. Are you starting to see patterns in the way you write now? You're on your third book?
Yeah.
You're less doubting yourself a little bit less?
Yeah, and there's also that adjustment of going from being an aspiring writer to being published and being out in public, and that adjustment, like changing from just writing for yourself through to needing to post on social media regularly and doing appearances and all of that. That's a really big shift to go through mentally for authors. And we probably don't talk about that enough, actually, that no one can really prepare you for the transition from just being your own little person and then sharing it with your agent and your publisher. And then suddenly, boom, it feels like you're exposed to the world. And because you put your heart and soul into your writing, it feels very vulnerable.
Yeah, there's definitely a course we could do on how to prepare yourself and it's for publicity, because that is never really taught in anything that you learn. Everything's so focused on getting published that when you are gearing up towards that publicity, and you often get a few months of it beforehand, how you can best prepare yourself for that, especially if you're a nervous speaker or you're not very confident in putting yourself out there, which you have to learn to get over really quickly, don't you? I remember with my first book, can you believe this? I actually said to an interviewer, oh, you know what? It's not that good. I can do it so much better next time. If I had a new just about to be published novelist sitting in my office, I would say, for whatever you do not say that. Your book is brilliant, whether it is or it isn't. It's brilliant as far as you're concerned. That's all you have to say about it. There's definitely some PR tips.
But nerves, just nerves. And that's the thing. Things fly out of your mouth. And oh my God, I remember doing my first, like we talked about a year ago, doing my first interview with Pam. And then I finished it and spent like 48 hours just going, I'm going to sound like the biggest idiot and everyone's going to hate me. Like straight away, like that little, that little voice in your head that's like, who do you think you are? Why did you say that? You sound so arrogant. Oh my God. And just dying on the inside. Like
It's imposter syndrome, really. It is ongoing imposter syndrome.
Everybody has it.
It doesn't go away, even with fourth and fifth books, it doesn't go away. If you're lovely to talk to you, Kel, I'm just going to say some paid subscribers now, if you're like going to have a little chat about the day-to-day nitty-gritty nuts and bolts of writing, the publishing world. So that's a special segment for paid subscribers to Pamela's Writes for Women podcast. So if you tune into that and check out the website about getting paid up for that. And we'll move on to that now. Look, Kel, it's been absolutely great talking to you as usual. I could talk to you for hours about craft, process and books, but we've got stuff to do, book to write, and always see Starlet Tide on the shelves. It's going to be February in the US, and I think it's March, isn't it, for Australia?
We've actually moved. It's going to be the 12th of February in Australia now too. And
that's when simultaneous publication or simultaneous release is what we all need in the world. I was always thinking, why do they do this? It's just like encouraging pirating. That was we used to pirate movies. You can't do that because that's just going to ask people to go and try and get it illegally if it's not available. They want to buy it. So when can we find you online, Kel? Tell everybody where you are most active on socials.
Instagram is my favorite. It's Kel in the Woods. I am on Facebook and Twitter but I don't check them much. So Instagram's best for me, and my website. So kellwoods.com.au, and you can email me there as well. So there's a form. You want to ask me anything, and people do get in touch if there's anything you want to ask me. And I'm also on Substack too, actually. I've started doing it. Yeah, on Substack. And it seems a lot of authors are on there now.
A rich environment for reading. You get all sorts of information on there. Obviously, Starlet Tide available for pre-order now, and you are going to love it. I loved After the Forest, but I have to say, I loved Starlet Tide even more.
Thank you.
That's quite an achievement. So well done, Kel. All right, take care, and we'll speak to you next time.
See you. Thanks, Jo.